Hey guys, so finally going to do the A-arm video. Bunch of things to talk about at the A-arms. Some important, some not so important. So let's just start to break these down. I have a couple sets here, and then I'm going to take you around my bikes and show you some other ones and the differences of them. TRX 450R 05. One of the main differences with stock arms versus aftermarket is these are mild steel, whereas aftermarket you're going to get 4130 chromoly. The other thing you'll see is these have no adjustments. So the uppers have no heims, the lowers are fixed. There's no ball joint adjustments. They're all fixed. So the stock arms, great for recreational riding. Nothing serious there. They're not set up for any adjustments, any different riding styles. It's just you get what you get. Then we look at, this is a set of Lone Star DC Pro. And you can see the bottom is fixed. So we've got a ball joint, we've got everything fixed here, no adjustments. But then the uppers have both adjustable heims and they have the adjustable ball joint. So that gives you a lot more flexibility in your riding. And probably before we even get into the adjustability, we want to talk about, well, what size arms do I need? And I get this question all the time, what should I run? And that's it's tough to build a bike you really can't build a bike to do everything. Let's say you're racing. If you're racing motocross, you want it to be wide, you want it to sit low. So that changes your suspension setup. If you're duning, again, you want it wide. But the suspension doesn't need to be as low. If you're racing GNCC, you don't want to be wide because you're running through trees, but you still want the clearance. So that's another setup. If you're running works like I do, you want it wide and you want the clearance. So there's all these different combinations, and every type of riding really needs a different setup. What I would say is that if you're a general rider, whether it be some dunes, some trees, some whatever, I would recommend to everybody to do a +2 A-arm. And that's, it sits right in the middle. +2, +1 is even better. When you get into the +1, they're not all +1. Some are +3/4, different measurements there. But let's say you're a guy that likes to do wheelies. Well, you may not want that +1 because what that's doing is it's changing your center of gravity, the center point in your quad. You're pushing it forward. So if you want to do a wheelie, it's going to be a little bit harder to do a wheelie with a +1 versus a +0, a 0 offset. Again, you can adjust gearing for that. In general, I would say, stick with the +2, +1 for general riding. If you're running GNCC, you're going to want a +1 because you're tight in the trees and you don't want to be getting hung up. As far as adjustability, again, it depends on your riding style. Depending on what size tires you run, you need adjustability for your camber, your toe, all these other things, and you got to figure out what's that general thing. So, when you look at an arm, when you have the upper with the adjustable heims, most lowers are fixed. You're really not going to adjust the lowers. But the upper, by adjusting you got two adjustments for toe, and toe is the camber. So if you look at camber, you have camber, caster, and toe. Camber is your tire sitting like this. Caster is your spindles forward or backward, and that changes your steering. And then you have toe, which is in and out. Toe is across the board. You want that toe, you want it set so that the front measurement, center your tire in the middle of the height of your tire, you want it to be an 1/8 inch to a 1/4 inch max in. So that means, 1/8 inch is probably ideal. You want the measurement in the front to be an 1/8 inch shorter than the measurement of the rear. Same measurement point front to back. So that one is fairly easy to set up. It helps with 2 people because trying to get in there and get the right measurements, 2 people, good for that. Then you have your caster, which is your spindle rake. So just like on a vehicle, you know, I set the caster on my Jeep to a certain amount, and the more negative caster you have, you're pitching the spindles back. So what that's going to do is give you more stability in the straights, high speed. And by putting them forward more, which they do in MX, you're going to get quicker steering. So it's basically the speed of your steering. So quick versus high speed straights, you want it slow, you want it stable. And then you've got your camber, which is your top. So camber, typically you want that at ride height, and we'll, you know, as we get more into the building a race quad, we'll talk about ride height versus sitting and all this other stuff. But at ride height, so with you sitting on the machine, you want the top of your tire, so if you were to take the outer edge of your tire and put a square on it, you want that to be in 1/4 of an inch, both sides. Because when the suspension compresses, it's going to push it out, and that affects your traction. So as you come off a big jump, you squat, you need to turn, that changes your contact point. So, you know, those two settings are general. The one that changes more is caster, depending on your riding style. And, you know, typically I'll run like a 5-degree negative caster, or if on my desert bike, I may run it as high as 7 degrees, because that's going to give me the straight tracking. So that's where all these adjustments come in. And when you have a fixed lower and you have Heims and an adjustable ball joint, what you can do for your caster is you're going to adjust these in or out, and what it's going to do is it's going to move the arm this way, and that's what affects your spindle. So your spindle is going to go back and forth. And you always make sure all your settings are the same on each side. So on a setup like this, what I would do is put it on, put everything kind of in close, because the farther out that this ball joint is, the more susceptible it is to bending. So I like to keep the ball joints in as close as I can and still keep the settings. So I'll basically use these, the upper Heims, to adjust the caster, and I'll use the outer to adjust my camber. So that camber should, you know, once you get it in there, you'll figure it out. These are the most annoying to adjust, because you got to keep popping them out, putting them back in. This one, I never tighten down. You never want to tighten down your spindles on your ball joints until you get all you want it in there, snug it up, but don't lock it down, because when you lock it down, that taper is going to sit in there, and it's annoying to get out. And I'll show you a tool that I use. Motion Pro has it. Makes life so much easier, because I used to use a bolt with a nut and try to get it in there to pop them off. That tool makes it a lot easier. But always leave everything loose. Never put your nuts on whenever you install the front end. Just put the bolts through, get them seated in there, get it on the ground, keep everything loose, just snugged up, so that you can adjust it, because you will have to adjust it. So, an interesting thing about this, these are actually, to my knowledge, the only +1 DC Pro A-arms for a 250R, TRX 250R. These, I bought a quad off a buddy of mine. He's friends with the owner of LSR, Dan, and he had these custom made. So I'm hanging on to these. Don't ask to buy them, because when I eventually move back east and run GNCC, I'm going to use these. So, you know, that's kind of the general idea with A-arms. I'm not going to talk about the best. I've said that in the past, because it's all subjective. Obviously, you guys know who the major players are, the major brands. They're all using 4130. The difference you'll see is some companies will use a 1-inch tube on the top. Some companies will use a 7/8. These OEMs are only 3/4. And then you get someone like Roll Design, they use something like 1.18, 1.2. Honestly, the upper arms, you're not gonna see many issues with. It's usually the lowers, and you know, you just want, like I said, any of the major players, any of the major companies out there. I'm not gonna say one is better than the other. Obviously, certain names have a kind of flair to them. They always have, and they've been around for a long time. And you guys know who those are. But this was more about length, long travel versus short standard travel. That gets into a whole other debate, and we could probably talk about that more when I get into shocks, but pretty much long travel, you know, I don't even want to get into that right now. I need to think about that one more and how to describe it. So we'll talk about that during, when I do the shock video. But what I want to do now is I'm gonna show you some of the other arms I have. I had a set of Gibsons on the hybrid, which are not made anymore, the 250R. I've got Roll Design 450 arms, Roll Design 250 arms, and I've got Texera arms. So every one of those adjusts differently, and they're all great arms, no issues with any of them. Each one's set up differently. Some of them use ball joints, some of them use spherical bearings. Probably a good point to talk about that. Spherical bearings versus ball joints. Well, spherical bearings are, you know, a circle with a sphere inside, and there's a Teflon inner that they slide on to keep them, you know, you don't want metal to metal. So the main difference between spherical and regular ball joints is over time the rubber, as I'm sure you've all seen, the rubber is going to crack and wear out, and once it cracks and wear out, dirt and water and all that other stuff gets in there, it's going to shorten the life of the bearing. Spherical, they're exposed all the time, and the Teflon is going to help keep that lubrication. Eventually they'll wear out as well. I can't say, I honestly don't know which one lasts longer. All I know is that most of mine are spherical, and every time I wash them, I use the Teflon lube that I talked about in a previous video, and it's just my regimen. You keep them lubed up, it keeps the water out, keeps them rusting, all that other stuff. Whereas the ball joints, you can't lube. You know, they are what they are. They're sealed in there. It is what it is. As far as changing a ball joint, usually you have a C-clip of some sort versus a spherical, where you have the other circular clamps, circular rings that go in there. People kind of get freaked out about those. Honestly, once you know how to take them out and put them in, it's super easy. Use a little tiny screwdriver, you get it, you pull it out, peel it out in a ring, and then when you put it back in, it actually goes in easier than it came out. So the other difference is, usually with spherical bearings, like in a Roll Design arm, they have to be pressed in. Not everybody has a press, whereas the standard ball joint just screws in. So something to think about. For me, I'll run any of the major brand arms. Of course, I have certain arms on my quads. It just kind of ended up that way. But as long as you stay with one of the good brands, then you really should have no issues. So, so that's kind of the general theory. And you know, again, guys, feel free to hit me up, private message, direct message. I'm happy to answer any questions you might have. I'm sure there's other stuff I can get into, stuff that I've run into. You know, we've got ways of fitting 400EX arms on 250R, the 250R frame, because they're a little bit different. You need spacers. I've actually eliminated the spacers and had custom bushings made, which makes it much nicer, because once you get into trying to fit 1.5 millimeter spacers on each side and get everything aligned, it's just a pain. So, so yeah, I can give you all that info. I've pretty much been through every spindle and rotor and whatever combination. I know what works, what doesn't. My 250R right now, I've got the roll arms with 06 plus 450R spindles. I just ordered a new set of arms for that are going to use the D05 spindles, and that's yet another conversation if we're looking into upgrading spindles and stuff, and why everybody wants the 05 spindles. There's science behind that, and I actually have a buddy who could explain it more in depth than anybody I've ever known, but I can give you an overview. So we'll talk about that when I do the race build, and I'll show you the difference in the spindles and why people choose certain things. But so let's take a look at some other spindles. So here's the 05 TRX 450R roll arms, and what you'll notice about these compared to what I just talked about is they're all fixed. So your lowers, your uppers are fixed, your lower is fixed. You only have one adjustment, and these are by design. They sell different configurations based on whether you're doing Desert, MX, and Desert MX are the same because you want to run wide, you run a certain caster and all that stuff. And these are all prefix caster. Prefix caster, prefix camber. Prefix caster, adjustable camber, and this is going to adjust your in and out. And then your toe is always adjusted by your tie rod, so that's independent of the A-arm itself. Again, roll arms, I think these are 1.182 diameter, or at least the bottoms are. I forget what, I think these are 1 inch uppers, but the lowers are thicker. So these are really easy to install because you don't have to mess with all those heims up here. All you're doing is setting your put your 1/4 inch, you want your 1/4 inch toe in, you lean in, and then you adjust the tie rod for the toe. Then we've got Gibson arms. So Gibson are similar to the LSR, where you have, again, the fixed bottoms. You've got, on this it's different because you've got a fixed top on the outer, but you've got your heims up top. And these are a little bit trickier to adjust because you're adjusting both your caster and your camber using these. So that means I'm gonna screw these out to get my correct camber with the lean in. So I would adjust them out evenly to get that, and then I would adjust either the front or the rear out or in, and it's gonna swing that top arm, and that's gonna change the angle of your caster. So usually you measure the caster in line here. There's a couple different ways to measure it, and we can get into that later, but that's the difference with a Gibson arm. Again, it's just the adjustment. So again, it's really important to leave everything loose when you install it so that you can make all those adjustments because you're doing it all up here. And the third one we have is the Texera. Texera is another different setup. Again, you got your fixed lowers, you've got your fixed upper, but theirs, you've got both your caster, they have a quick caster adjustment, and your camber. So you're going to, standard ball joint, you're going to unscrew it to adjust your camber, the in and out, but these have fixed notches in them for your caster adjustments. So this is actually kind of a cool setup because you're doing it all in one spot. And you can tighten everything up back here, but just by loosening this and moving these in different ways, you're going to get all those different degrees of caster adjustment. So kind of a cool setup. There's, again, none, I'm not going to say one is better than the other. Some are easier to adjust than others, but they all have those adjustments as opposed to the OEM where you don't get any adjustments. So that's pretty much the gist of A-arms. I'm sure there's other stuff we could talk about, but it's kind of like, well, what kind of riding are you going to do, and how much you want to spend? That's obviously a big thing there is just the expense. And do you need roll arms to run recreational riding or dunes? Absolutely not. All the good ones. You got Walsh, you got Hauser, you got Texera, you got Roll. Obviously the Gibsons aren't made anymore, but there's still plenty out there. So it really just comes down to budget, what your riding style is, and then you kind of come up with your width, and that's about it. And then you've got to figure out if you want long travel or standard travel. So we'll talk about that in another video, but that's it for now.